The first snowflakes fell 3 months early that year, dusting the pines surrounding Sarah Miller's remote mountain cabin. At 7 months pregnant and miles from the nearest neighbor, she watched the weather report with growing dread. The satellite connection flickered as the meteorologist's voice crackled through. Unprecedented storm system. Potential to be the worst in 50 years. She placed a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick as if sensing her fear. Outside, the wind began to howl, a mournful song that would become the soundtrack to her isolation. The mountain pass, her only connection to civilization, would soon be impassable. With dwindling supplies, no medical care, and a baby on the way, Sarah faced the ultimate test of survival. Could one woman's determination overcome nature's most brutal season? Sarah traced her finger across the worn photograph, her and David on their wedding day, standing before the very cabin she now called home. 3 years had passed since that moment, 1 year since the climbing accident that took him from her. The mountain had given and taken in equal measure. "I promised we'd raise our children here," she whispered, returning the photo to its place beside her bed. "And I intend to keep that promise." Before the isolation of mountain life, Sarah had been one of Colorado's most respected wilderness guides. 38 years of life had etched fine lines around her eyes, markers of days spent beneath an unforgiving sun, leading city folk through terrain they could barely comprehend. The same terrain that now separated her from civilization. Her last trip to town had been 6 weeks ago. Dr. Reynolds hadn't minced words. "Sarah, your age and the baby's position make this a high-risk pregnancy. You should be near medical facilities. The cabin is too remote." She'd smiled politely but never considered staying in town. The mountain was her sanctuary, not her prison. Besides, the baby wasn't due until January, plenty of time before the serious snow. Sarah moved to the kitchen, wincing at the persistent ache in her lower back. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Nature doesn't care about your plans." How right he had been. The storm arriving in September instead of December was proof enough. She opened her supply cabinet, mentally calculating. When she'd stocked up last month, she'd planned for normal conditions, not an Arctic siege. The pantry held dried beans, rice, canned goods, flour and preserved vegetables from her summer garden. Her freezer contained venison from last hunting season. With careful rationing, maybe 2 months of food. The baby kicked hard beneath her ribs. "I know, little one," she murmured. "This wasn't the plan. After David died, many expected her to leave the mountain. Her sister Elena had offered her apartment in Denver, insisting isolation wasn't healthy for grief. But Sarah understood something others didn't. The mountains weren't just where she lived. They were part of who she was. David had understood that too. Their love story had begun right here, 10 years ago, when he'd hired her as a guide, a photographer documenting wildlife. He'd been unlike her typical clients, respectful of the wilderness, knowledgeable, self-sufficient. By the 3rd day, they were sharing life stories beside campfires. By the expedition's end, they'd made plans to meet again. Marriage came 2 years later. The decision to try for a child took longer. At 37, Sarah had worried the opportunity had passed. The positive test last spring had felt like David reaching across the divide, offering one last gift. The cabin had been his grandfather's, a sturdy structure built in the 1950s and improved upon over decades. David had modernized it with solar panels, a satellite dish, and propane backup systems. They'd spent summers reinforcing the roof, insulating walls, and expanding the root cellar. Each improvement had been made with their future family in mind. Now Sarah stood alone, watching through frosted windows as snow accumulated at a rate she'd rarely seen, even in midwinter. The wind moaned through the pines, branches heavy with snow bowing in submission. The weather radio crackled again. Static-filled updates confirmed her fears. Record-breaking cold, unprecedented snowfall, roads already impassable up to the lower elevations. The mountain pass would be closed indefinitely. Sarah moved to her desk and opened her journal, turning to the section where she detailed her pregnancy. Week 28, the baby approximately the size of an eggplant, more active each day. Childbirth still months away, but now a terrifying prospect without medical support. She'd delivered calves on her father's ranch as a teenager. She'd assisted once when a client went into premature labor during a summer trek, but delivering her own child, alone, "We've got no choice but to be ready," she told her unborn child, resting her hand protectively over her belly. "Your dad used to say these mountains don't forgive the unprepared." Outside, the first pine branch cracked under the weight of gathering snow, falling to the ground with a muffled thud. Sarah reached for her coat. She needed to secure the woodpile before it was completely buried. This was just the beginning. Sarah placed the satellite phone carefully on its charging cradle, her last technological lifeline to the world below. The device was temperamental at best, functional only from the south-facing window on clear days. With the storm rolling in, even that limited connection might soon vanish. She dialed her sister's number, watching through the window as heavy clouds engulfed the peaks. Each ring seemed to stretch longer than the last. "Sarah? Thank God. I've been trying to reach you since yesterday." Elena's voice crackled with static and concern. "The storm's moving faster than predicted," Sarah replied, pressing the phone tighter to her ear. "How bad is it down there?" "They've closed Route 9 already. The county's declaring an emergency." A burst of static interrupted her. "Sarah, please tell me you're coming down." The wind howled louder outside, as if challenging the suggestion. "It's already too late," Sarah said, her voice calm despite the tightness in her chest. "The logging road was barely passable yesterday. By now it's completely snowed in. Then I'm calling search and rescue." "They can, and risk someone else's life." "Absolutely not." Sarah's tone left no room for argument. "I'm prepared, Elena. I've got supplies, shelter, heat, but the baby isn't due for months. By then, they'll have cleared the roads." Sarah wasn't certain of this, but she needed Elena to believe it. Static garbled her sister's response. Sarah could make out only fragments. "Doctor said, high risk. Can't believe you did." "Elena, I'm losing you." Sarah watched as the signal strength indicator dropped to 1 bar. "I'll be fine. I know these mountains. Dad taught us both how to. Dad didn't prepare us for childbirth in isolation." Elena's voice broke through clearly for a moment. "This isn't just about you anymore." The baby kicked, as if in agreement, a sharp jab beneath her ribs. Sarah winced. "I know that. Why do you think I'm staying put?" The risk of traveling now in these conditions, she let the thought hang unfinished. "I've got to go. The battery's nearly dead, and I need to save it for emergencies." "This is an emergency. I'll call when I can." "I love you." Sarah's finger hovered over the end button. "Wait. Jacob might be able to." The connection died, Elena's words lost to the growing storm. Sarah stared at the blank screen, a cold weight settling in her stomach. Jacob, her sister's new boyfriend, some kind of wilderness first responder or search and rescue volunteer. She'd only met him once, found him well-intentioned but overconfident, the type who thought reading survival books equated to actual experience. Sarah set the phone down and moved to the window. The view that normally stretched for miles, rolling forests, giving way to distant peaks, had shrunk to just yards, everything beyond obscured by thickening snow. The first real wave of the storm was arriving. Time to move. Sarah pulled on her heavy coat, struggling to zip it over her pregnant belly. She'd need to secure everything outside before conditions deteriorated further. The moment she opened the door, wind stole her breath. Snow whipped horizontally, stinging her exposed skin. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees in the last hour. With methodical efficiency, Sarah checked her outdoor preparations. The firewood was stacked and covered on the protected side of the cabin. Water barrels were filled and insulated against freeze. The generator had a fresh tank of propane. As she worked, Sarah spoke to her unborn child, a habit she'd developed over the solitary months. "Your Aunt Elena worries too much," she said, securing a tarp over the woodpile. "She forgets what we learned growing up here. The mountains provide if you know how to ask properly." The snow was falling faster now, already accumulating in drifts, against the north side of the cabin. Sarah felt the first real stirrings of concern. In all her years on the mountain, she'd never seen snow this heavy before Halloween, let alone in September. Back inside, she removed her outer layers and warmed her hands by the wood stove. The windows rattled with each gust of wind, the cabin creaking like an old ship at sea. Sarah moved methodically through each room, checking for drafts, ensuring windows were sealed. At the kitchen counter, she unfolded a topographical map of the surrounding area. Her cabin sat in a small valley, protected from the worst winds but vulnerable to heavy snow accumulation. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles down the mountain, a retired forest ranger who'd likely already headed to town for the winter. The radio forecaster's words echoed in her mind: "Unprecedented storm system, worst in 50 years." Sarah studied the map, tracing the rates down the mountain with her finger, the route that was now impassable. For better or worse, she was on her own. Outside, daylight was fading fast, though it was barely mid-afternoon. The storm had brought an early, artificial night. Sarah lit kerosene lamps, their warm glow pushing back against the growing darkness. The satellite phone lay silent in its cradle, the signal indicator now completely dark. Her last connection to the outside world was gone. Sarah's leather-bound journal lay open on the kitchen table, its pages illuminated by lamplight. Each entry was written in her precise handwriting, a habit from her guiding days when clear documentation could mean the difference between life and death. Today's entry would be the most critical yet. "Day 1 of storm," she wrote, the pencil scratching across the paper. "Early assessment of supplies and conditions." She flipped to a blank page and drew careful columns: food, water, medicine, fuel, tools. Each category would need meticulous inventory and rationing calculations. The pantry revealed her standard winter preparations: 20 pounds of rice, 15 of dried beans, flour, sugar, dried fruit, canned vegetables, preserved meat. The chest freezer held venison from last season, berries she'd gathered in summer, and vegetables from her garden. The root cellar contained potatoes, onions, carrots, and apples stored in sand. Food supplies adequate for approximately 65 days with strict rationing, she noted. Stretching possible with successful hunting trapping if weather permits. Water wouldn't be an immediate concern. Her cabin's system collected from the roof into filtered barrels, and when those ran dry, she could melt snow. The creek that ran nearby would likely freeze solid, but she'd never lack for frozen water. Medicine was more worrying. Sarah pulled the emergency kit from beneath her bed and spread its contents on the quilt. Bandages, antiseptics, splints, pain relievers, all standard wilderness first aid. But her prenatal vitamins were running low, and her specialized supplies for childbirth were minimal. Medical supplies sufficient for standard emergencies, she wrote. Inadequate for childbirth complications. Sarah paused, hand resting on her belly. The baby kicked vigorously, as if protesting the assessment. "I know," she murmured. "We'll figure it out." Fuel came next. The woodshed contained enough seasoned logs to last 3 months of normal winter use. With careful conservation, maybe 4. The propane tank for cooking was 3/4 full, and she had kerosene for the lamps. The generator had enough fuel for occasional use, primarily to run the freezer periodically and charge essential devices. Tools were perhaps her greatest asset. David had been meticulous about maintenance, and the workshop attached to the cabin contained everything from basic hammers and saws to specialized equipment for repairs. With these she could adapt and create what she might need. Sarah moved to the window, wiping condensation from the glass. The snow showed no signs of relenting. Already it had reached the lower windowsills, and the wind had formed 6-foot drifts against the north side of the cabin. Back at the table, she pulled out a calendar and circled a date in early January, her estimated due date. Then she counted backward from today, calculating the weeks of pregnancy completed. 28 weeks, nearly 7 months. 12 weeks until due date, she wrote. Supplies must last minimum 15 weeks to allow for recovery time. Sarah did the math 3 times, but the conclusion remained unchanged. Even with the most careful rationing, she would likely run short on some essentials before help could arrive. Hunting and foraging would be necessary, dangerous activities in her condition, doubly so in extreme weather. The baby kicked again, harder this time. Sarah winced, then smiled slightly. "You're right to be concerned," she said, "but your mom has survived worse." Had she, though? Sarah couldn't recall a challenge of this magnitude. Even her most difficult expeditions had teammates, equipment, and extraction plans if things went south. This was different. Complete isolation with a ticking clock in the form of her growing child. She returned to her journal, adding a new category: projects. Under it, she began a list: reinforce north wall against snow pressure, set up emergency signals visible from air, create snow markers to locate buried resources, prepare berthing area with available supplies, construct snowshoes for deeper snow navigation. Sarah leaned back, stretching her sore back. The enormity of her situation settled over her like the snow outside, silent, heavy, inexorable. She had always found comfort in planning, in breaking insurmountable challenges into manageable tasks. But now, as she reviewed her lists and calculations, the margin for error seemed vanishingly small. The wood stove popped and crackled, the cabin's warmth a stark contrast to the frigid world outside. Sarah closed the journal and placed her hand on the worn, leather cover, a silent promise to herself and her unborn child. Beyond the cabin walls, the blizzard howled its challenge. Inside, a woman armed only with a journal, knowledge and unwavering determination, prepared to answer it. 3 days into the storm, Sarah woke to a bone-deep chill. The familiar warmth of the cabin had vanished overnight, replaced by a creeping cold that condensed her breath into visible puffs. Something was wrong. She pushed herself upright, her movements slow and careful. Pregnancy had changed her center of gravity, made her once fluid motions awkward and deliberate. The wood stove in the corner, usually radiating steady heat, stood dark and silent. "No, no, no," she whispered, shuffling across the cold wooden floor. The cast iron surface, normally too hot to touch, felt cool beneath her fingers. Sarah opened the firebox door and found only grey ash and a few lingering embers. The fire had gone out, something that hadn't happened in all her years on the mountain. She quickly rebuilt the fire, adding kindling and carefully nursing the remaining embers back to flames. As light filled the stove, Sarah spotted the problem. A hairline crack running along the back panel of the firebox, widening at the bottom where it leaked ash onto the floor. "Damn it," the words emerged as a cloud in the frigid air. The stove wasn't just her main source of heat, it was her only source. Without it, survival would become impossible within days, perhaps hours. The temperature outside had dropped to -20 according to the thermometer mounted outside her window. Inside, it was already below freezing. Sarah placed protective hands over her belly. "Don't worry, your grandpa taught me how to fix these things." In the workshop attached to the cabin, Sarah found her father's old metal repair kit. Her fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the latches. Inside lay specialized tools for working with cast iron files, hammers, clamps, and a crucible for melting repair compound. She'd watched her father repair the same stove decades ago. The memory surfaced as she gathered supplies, the smell of hot metal, her father's patient voice explaining each step, her small hands helping to mix the repair compound. "The trick is getting the temperatures right," he'd said. Too cold and the patch won't bond. Too hot and you'll make the crack worse. Back in the main room, Sarah assessed the damage more carefully. The crack was approximately 8 inches long, widening from hairline at the top to nearly a quarter inch at the bottom. The stove would need to cool completely before she could apply any repair. That meant hours without heat. Sarah worked quickly, layering on every piece of warm clothing she owned. She draped blankets over the windows to retain what little warmth remained and block the gap beneath the door with rolled towels. By noon, the stove had cooled enough to begin repairs. Sarah knelt awkwardly before it, her pregnant belly making it difficult to reach the damaged area. The baby chose that moment to deliver a series of sharp kicks. "I know you don't like the cold," Sarah murmured. "That makes 2 of us. Let me concentrate now." Using a wire brush, she carefully cleaned the area around the crack, removing soot and loose particles. The metal was badly stressed, likely from the extreme temperature fluctuations of the unusually severe weather. With files and a small hammer, Sarah gently shaped the edges of the crack, creating a channel for the repair compound to adhere to. Her hands, normally steady, trembled slightly from the cold. She couldn't feel her toes anymore and her lower back ached from the awkward position. The repair compound needed to be mixed precisely. Too thin and it would run without filling the crack. Too thick and it wouldn't penetrate deeply enough. Sarah measured carefully, combining the powdered metal, binding agent and water. "Like making a cake," she said to the baby, "except this one needs to last us all winter." Applying the compound required a steady hand. Sarah used a narrow metal spatula to work the mixture deep into the crack, starting at the bottom where the damage was worst. The compound would harden as it dried, creating a seal strong enough to withstand the heat of the fire if she'd done it correctly. With the repair complete, Sarah faced the next challenge. The compound needed to cure for 6 hours before she could light the stove again. 6 more hours in the deepening cold. She retreated to her bed, piling on every available blanket and trying to ignore the numbness spreading through her extremities. The cabin temperature had fallen below 20 degrees. Too cold for too long could harm the baby. "Just a few more hours," she promised, rubbing her belly through layers of blankets. "Then we'll be warm again." Outside, the blizzard continued unabated, battering the cabin with wind and snow. Inside, a woman fought against cold and fear, waiting for metal to cure while her own strength was tested. The repair had to work. There was no plan B. A week into the storm, Sarah stood at her kitchen counter, coiling thin wire between her fingers. The simple snares took shape with practiced precision, each loop, twist, and trigger mechanism assembled from memory. Her father had taught her trapping when she was just 9, his calloused hands guiding hers through the motions. "A proper snare isn't just about catching," he'd said. "It's about respect, quick and clean. Anything less dishonors both the hunter and the hunted." Sarah placed the completed snare on the growing pile. 10 should be enough for the first trapline. Her food calculations had confirmed what she already suspected. Without supplementing her stored provisions, she would run dangerously short by month 2. The baby shifted inside her, pressing against her ribs. Sarah winced, adjusting her position. "Yes, I know what you're thinking," she said, patting her belly. "Your mum's going to waddle through snowdrifts to set traps." Not exactly what the doctor ordered. She gathered the snares into a canvas bag along with wooden stakes and her small hunting knife. The snowshoes hanging by the door would be essential. The storm had deposited nearly 4 feet of snow, with drifts twice that height in places. Sarah dressed methodically in layers. Thermal underwear, wool pants, 2 pairs of socks, a flannel shirt, sweater, and her heaviest coat, which barely closed over her belly now. She wound a scarf around her neck and lower face and pulled a fur-lined hat down over her ears. "First outing," she announced to the empty cabin. "Don't wait up." The cold hit her like a physical blow when she opened the door. Even with her face mostly covered, the air burned her lungs. The world had transformed into an alien landscape of white, familiar landmarks, buried distances distorted. Sarah strapped the snowshoes to her boots and stepped carefully off the porch. Despite her pregnancy weight, the snowshoes distributed her mass effectively across the snow's surface. She carried a walking stick for balance and wore a small backpack containing emergency supplies, matches, extra gloves, a space blanket, jerky and a thermos of hot tea. The trapline route had been carefully planned. She would follow a semicircle path roughly 200 yards from the cabin, placing snares near signs of rabbit and squirrel activity. Close enough to check daily, even in her condition, yet far enough to find undisturbed wildlife. Moving through deep snow while pregnant proved more exhausting than she'd anticipated. Every few minutes, Sarah paused to catch her breath, her heart racing with exertion. Sweat dampened her innermost layers despite the freezing temperature, a dangerous condition that could lead to hypothermia once she stopped moving. "Pace yourself," she muttered. "It's not a race." The first location seemed promising, a small depression beneath a cluster of pines where the snow was thinner, showing traces of small animal tracks. Sarah knelt awkwardly, her belly making the position difficult, and cleared a small area to set the snare. Her fingers, despite the gloves, grew numb as she worked the wire and positioned the trigger. "Sorry about this," she said to the unseen future occupant, "but we need to eat." By the fourth trap, Sarah felt lightheaded. She leaned against a tree trunk, sipping hot tea from her thermos. The forest stood eerily silent around her, the usual bird song and wildlife sounds muffled by snow and absent due to the storm. She was alone in a white void, her labored breathing the only sound breaking the silence. The baby kicked hard as if protesting the cold or the exertion. I know," Sarah soothed, placing a gloved hand over the spot. "Just a few more, then we'll head back." Setting the remaining traps took nearly 2 hours. What would have been a 40-minute task before pregnancy now stretched her endurance to its limits. As she placed the final snare, Sarah noticed the light fading, the short winter day already surrendering to dusk. The return journey proved even more difficult. Her muscles ached with fatigue, and the extra weight of the baby seemed to have doubled. Halfway back, a sharp pain lanced through her lower abdomen, forcing her to stop. "No," she gasped, clutching her belly. "Not now, not here." She stood motionless, counting seconds, until the pain subsided. Not a contraction, just her body warning her against overexertion. Still, fear had lodged itself in her chest, a cold companion to match the landscape around her. The cabin lights came into view as darkness fell fully, a golden beacon in the gathering gloom. Sarah had never been so grateful for the sight. She stumbled the final yards, her legs laden with exhaustion. Inside, the wood stove's warmth enveloped her like an embrace. Sarah removed her outer layers with trembling hands and collapsed into her chair, her body simultaneously buzzing with adrenaline and heavy with fatigue. "We did it," she told her unborn child, massaging her belly gently. "Our first hunt together." The triumph was small but significant. Tomorrow she would check the traps, hopefully finding the beginnings of additional food stores. Tonight, she had proven to herself that she could still function, still provide, despite the limitations of her pregnancy and the hostile environment. As Sarah prepared a simple dinner of bean soup, she contemplated the ethical paradox of her situation, creating life while taking it, hunting to sustain her pregnancy. Nature's brutal calculus laid bare by necessity. "It's the way of things up here," she explained to her baby. "We take only what we need, give thanks for it, and never waste. That's how we survive." Outside, snow continued to fall in the darkness, covering her tracks, burying her trapline under fresh powder. Inside, a woman and her unborn child rested, having taken the first steps towards securing their survival in a winter that had come far too early. Dawn broke cold and clear, the storm briefly pausing as if gathering strength for another assault. Sarah stepped onto her porch, breath fogging in the frigid air. The trapline needed checking, but something immediately caught her eye. Tracks in the fresh snow, not the familiar imprints of rabbits or deer, but something larger, something predatory. Wolf tracks circled her cabin, a deliberate patrol that looped from the woodpile to the shed, and back again. Sarah knelt awkwardly to examine from the depth and stride length, a large male, likely pushed down from higher elevations by the same storm that had trapped her. "Looking for easier hunting grounds, aren't you?" she murmured, noting how the tracks meticulously investigated every possible entry point to her stores. Sarah retreated inside and retrieved her father's old Winchester 30-30 from its rack. The liver-action rifle had been his pride, the wood stock worn smooth from decades of handling. She hadn't fired it since last hunting season, but she checked it now with practiced hands. Action clear, barrel clean, ammunition ready. "Never thought I'd need you during pregnancy," she told the weapon as she loaded cartridges into the magazine. The familiar weight of the rifle brought complex emotions, her father's lessons about responsible use, David's discomfort with hunting, her own mixed feelings about taking life. The baby kicked hard as if sensing her disquiet. "Don't worry," she assured her unborn child. "It's just precautionary. Wolves rarely attack humans, but they're opportunistic when hungry enough. And this one's investigating our food supply." She pulled on her outdoor gear and slung the rifle across her rapier before heading to check her traps. The wolf tracks intersected with her path from yesterday, following her trail for some distance before veering off. The predator had already found her trapline. 2 snares had been sprung. The catch is gone, leaving only blood-speckled snow and disturbed ground. "Taking my hard-earned dinner, are you?" Sarah felt a grudging respect for the animal's resourcefulness, even as frustration mounted. 3 traps remained undisturbed, yielding 2 rabbits and a squirrel, enough for a hearty stew. Sarah reset the sprung traps and collected her catch, constantly scanning the tree line. The sense of being watched prickled at the back of her neck. That evening, as darkness fell early, Sarah prepared the day's catch at her kitchen table. The familiar routine of dressing game brought an almost meditative calm, her hands working efficiently despite her growing belly making it difficult to lean over the table. A sudden sound broke her concentration, the crack of wood outside, followed by shuffling at the woodpile. Sarah extinguished her lantern and moved silently to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Moonlight reflected off silver-gray fur. The wolf stood on her woodpile, his massive paws displacing logs as he investigated the tarp covering. In the pale light, Sarah could see his ribs showing through his winter coat. The storm had made hunting difficult for all predators. "You're as desperate as I am," she whispered, watching him paw at the covering, seeking anything to eat. Sarah weighed her options. Shooting the wolf would provide additional meat and eliminate competition for the same prey. It was the pragmatic choice. Yet something in the animal's determined struggle mirrored her own. Instead, she rapped sharply on the window glass. The wolf's head snapped up, yellow eyes locking onto the cabin. For a moment, predator and prey stared at each other across the divide of glass and civilization. Then, with deliberate slowness, the wolf descended from the woodpile and retreated several yards, still watching the cabin. "That's right," Sarah called. "This territory's taken." She reached for her rifle, opened the door a crack, and fired a single shot into the air. The sound cracked through the silent night like lightning. The wolf flinched but held his ground, assessing. "Go on," Sarah said firmly. "There's easier hunting elsewhere." After a tense moment, the wolf turned and loped toward the tree line, disappearing into shadow. Sarah closed the door, heart pounding. The confrontation had established boundaries, but she harbored no illusions. The wolf would return. Over the next 3 days, the dance continued. Each morning revealed new tracks. Each night brought sounds of the wolf testing defenses. Sarah's trapline yielded less as the predator learned to steal from her snares before she could check them. The competition for limited resources had become a battle of wits between 2 hungry survivors. On the 4th night, Sarah woke to a cacophony of splintering wood and falling metal. She grabbed her rifle and a flashlight, moving cautiously to the back door that connected to the storage shed. The sounds continued, deliberate destruction rather than stealthy theft. She cracked the door open, flashlight beam cutting through darkness. The wolf had broken through the shed's outer wall, creating a hole just large enough to squeeze through. Now he stood amidst scattered tools and storage containers, systematically destroying anything that smelled of food. Sarah raised her rifle, the crosshairs settling on the wolf's chest. One clean shot would end the competition for resources. Her finger tensed on the trigger. The wolf turned, yellow eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. Blood smeared his muzzle where rough wood had cut him in his desperate entry. Behind him, through the broken wall, two smaller forms moved in the shadows, half-grown pups, emaciated and trembling. "You're not alone either," Sarah whispered, lowering her rifle slightly. In that moment, another survivor with young to protect looked back at her. Different species, same fundamental drive, protect the next generation at all costs. Sarah's finger eased off the trigger. Instead, she fired another shot into the floor near the wolf's feet. The animal bolted through the hole with its pups, disappearing into the night. Tomorrow, she would repair the shed and secure it better. Tonight, she acknowledged the fragile boundary between compassion and survival, a line she wasn't yet ready to cross. The ominous crack echoed through the morning stillness like a gunshot. Sarah froze halfway across the yard, her arms full of firewood, and looked toward the sound. Nothing seemed amiss at first. The cabin stood sturdy against the white landscape, smoke curling from the chimney into the clear sky. Then her eyes caught the subtle shift in the snowpack, covering the root cellar entrance. A hairline fracture had appeared in the heavy wooden door, snow sliding into the newly formed gap. "No," she breathed, dropping the firewood and waddling as quickly as her pregnant body allowed toward the cellar. The root cellar had been David's pride, dug deep into the hillside, its walls reinforced with stone and timber, shelves lined with preserved foods. It contained nearly half of their winter provisions: canned vegetables, preserved fruits, cured meats, and root vegetables packed in sand. As Sarah approached, another crack sounded. The door's center beam had splintered under the weight of accumulated snow, allowing the heavy wooden door to sag inward. Through the widening gap, she could see snow already pouring onto the cellar step. Sarah brushed away snow from the door's edges, fingers scrabbling at the frozen metal handle. It wouldn't budge. The weight pressing down had jammed it completely. She pushed against the door with her shoulder, but her awkward stance and added weight from pregnancy made it impossible to generate enough force. "Think, Sarah," she muttered, surveying the situation. "Physics and leverage." The shed yielded a long metal pry bar. Sarah wedged it beneath the edge of the door and pushed down with all her strength. The door lifted slightly, then crashed back as the bar slipped on ice. She tried again, repositioning the bar, but gained only inches before her strength gave out. Sweat dampened her inner layers despite the cold. The baby shifted uncomfortably, pressing against her lungs and making each breath labored. Sarah leaned against the cabin wall, calculating her options and the diminishing time before complete collapse. "We need mechanical advantage," she told her unborn child, patting her belly absently. "Your dad would have rigged something clever." David. The thought sparked a memory. The pulley system they'd installed 2 summers ago to raise heavy beams during the cabin expansion. It still hung in the tool shed, unused since completion. The block and tackle was heavy, designed to lift several hundred pounds with minimal effort. Sarah dragged it from the shed, along with lengths of rope and the metal mounting bracket. Her engineering background from college, before she'd chosen the mountains over city life, surfaced as she assessed angles and load-bearing points. Working methodically despite her ungainly movements, Sarah secured the main pulley to the cabin's outer support beam. She threaded rope through the system, creating a 5-1 mechanical advantage, then attached the hook to a metal ring embedded in the cellar door's frame. "Simple machines," she explained to her baby as she worked. "They don't care how pregnant you are." With the system in place, Sarah grasped the free end of the rope and pulled. The difference was immediate. What her body couldn't accomplish alone, the pulley system made possible. The door creaked upward. snow sliding off in chunks. When the gap was wide enough, Sarah wedged a log beneath the door to hold it open. Peering inside, her heart sank. Snow had already filled the first few steps and continued to pour through gaps around the damaged frame. Worse, the center ceiling beam had cracked, threatening complete collapse. One problem at a time, she reminded herself. First, she needed to relieve the weight on the door. Sarah began carefully shoveling snow from the top, working methodically to avoid sudden shifts that might trigger total failure. The baby seemed to object to her exertion, delivering sharp kicks that momentarily stole her breath. "I know this isn't ideal," Sarah acknowledged, between labored breaths, "but we need what's down there." After an hour of careful shoveling, the immediate danger of door collapse had lessened. Now came the more complex challenge, repairing the cracked support beam inside. Sarah gathered tools and replacement lumber, then cautiously descended the stairs into the semi-darkness. The cellar air hung cold and damp, smelling of earth and preserved food. In the beam of her flashlight, Sarah assessed the damage. The central support had split near its middle, allowing the ceiling to sag dangerously. Several jars had already fallen from shelves, their contents frozen on the dirt floor. Working in the cramped space with her pregnant belly proved nearly impossible. Every movement required careful calculation, her center of gravity constantly shifting. The baby seemed particularly active, perhaps responding to her elevated heart rate and labored breathing in the confined space. "A little cooperation would be appreciated," she murmured during a particularly vigorous kick. Sarah positioned a temporary support post, then used the hammer to drive wooden wedges into place, gradually taking pressure off the damaged beam. With that stabilized, she could begin the more permanent repair. Sister boards bolted on either side of the crack to distribute the load. The drilling and hammering filled the small space with noise that masked the subtle sounds of shifting snow outside. Sarah was tightening the final bolt when she heard it. A soft whoosh, followed by a tremendous weight of snow sliding from the cabin roof onto the already stressed cellar entrance. The temporary brace groaned. Dirt sifted down from above. Sarah looked up just as the partially repaired beam gave way with a tremendous crack. She dove toward the stairs as shelves collapsed behind her, jars shattering and wood splintering. The cellar door slammed shut with the impact, plunging the space into complete darkness except for her dropped flashlight, which cast wild, spinning shadows before rolling to a stop. In the sudden silence, Sarah lay on the cold steps, arms protectively wrapped around her belly. The baby kicked vigorously, as if assuring her of its continued well-being. Sarah took a shaky breath and reached for the flashlight. The beam revealed a devastating scene: collapsed shelves, broken jars, months of preserved food now mixed with dirt and broken glass. The exit was completely blocked by fallen debris and the door itself jammed shut from the new weight of snow. Sarah was trapped, her air limited, her body 7 months pregnant, and no one knew where she was. Heat radiated from Sarah's skin, her nightgown damp with sweat, despite the cabin's chill. 3 days had passed since the root cellar collapse, 3 days of aching muscles and bruised ribs from her narrow escape. Now a new enemy had emerged: infection. She pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. The fever had begun last night, a subtle warmth that blossomed into burning by dawn, not uncommon after physical trauma, but dangerous in her isolated condition, especially while pregnant. The thermometer confirmed her fears. 100, not good, she whispered, voice raspy from dehydration. Sarah dragged herself to her supplies, movements sluggish and uncoordinated. The medicine cabinet yielded basic remedies: ibuprofen, acetaminophen, but pregnancy limited her options. Many fever reducers could harm the baby. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory: "The land provides what the body needs." Naomi Miller had been half Cherokee, her knowledge of herbal medicine passed down through generations. Sarah had absorbed those lessons reluctantly as a child, preferring her father's practical hunting skills to what seemed like mystical herbology. Now she pulled her grandmother's weathered book from the bookshelf, Traditional Plant Medicine, its pages yellowed and dog-eared, margins filled with handwritten notes. Sarah's fingers traced the familiar handwriting as fever made the letters swim before her eyes. Willow bark, she read, focusing with effort. Nature's aspirin, safe in moderate doses. Sarah dressed with difficulty, her body protesting every movement. The fever made her clumsy, her pregnant belly an awkward counterweight as she pulled on layers. Outside fresh snow had fallen, but the storm had temporarily abated. Weak sunlight filtering through clouds. She knew where willows grew, along the creek that ran 100 yards behind the cabin. In summer, the journey would take minutes. Now it might require the last of her strength. Using a walking stick for support, Sarah trudged through snow that reached her knees in places. Each step became an exercise in determination, her breath coming in visible puffs that dissipated in the cold air. Fever made the world tilt and spin around her, landmarks shifting like mirages. Keep going, she told herself, one hand pressed to her belly. The baby needs you functioning. The creek had nearly vanished beneath ice and snow, but the distinctive shape of willow branches still arched gracefully along its banks. Sarah approached the nearest tree, knife in hand. Beneath the snow-covered bark lay her medicine. If she could only reach it, kneeling was impossible in her condition. Instead, she braced herself against the trunk and carefully cut sections of younger branches, where the salicin concentration would be highest. Her fingers, numb with cold, struggled with the simple task. The return journey proved even more difficult. Twice Sarah stopped, leaning against trees as dizziness threatened to overwhelm her. The cabin seemed to recede with each step forward, a cruel illusion of the fever. 1 foot after another, she mumbled, just like guiding clients through altitude sickness. Inside the cabin again, Sarah collapsed into a chair, branches clutched in frozen hands. The fever protocol from her grandmother's book required focus. She barely possessed. Strip the bark, boil it slowly to extract the compounds, strain, cool, and drink. She worked mechanically, muscle memory guiding her where conscious thought faltered. The bitter smell of willow filled the cabin as steam rose from the pot. Sarah added dried raspberry leaf, also safe in pregnancy and good for calming uterine muscles, which had begun to cramp ominously. While the mixture steeped, she gathered other supplies. Elderberry preserved from last fall's harvest for immune support, dried echinacea for the infection, yarrow to break the fever through perspiration. Her grandmother had grown or foraged all these plants, teaching Sarah to identify each one by smell, texture, and habitat. Medicine isn't just in the plant, she'd told young Sarah. It's in knowing when to harvest, how to prepare, how much to use. Too little does nothing. Too much becomes poison. The final brew looked unappetizing, a dark liquid with flecks of plant material floating on the surface. Sarah strained it through cheesecloth and poured a careful dose into her mug. The taste was intensely bitter, making her already queasy stomach threaten rebellion. Down the hatch, she muttered, forcing herself to drink it all. Sarah crawled into bed, piling blankets around her despite the fever's heat. The traditional treatment required sweating out the infection, a miserable process, but one that had served her ancestors well before modern medicine. Through the fog of fever, Sarah placed a protective hand on her belly. The baby had been unusually quiet today, concerning, but not yet alarming. Another symptom to monitor. Your great-grandmother is helping us today, she told her unborn child. She knew this mountain when the trails were just animal paths. Not much changed since then, really. The medicine began its work as afternoon faded to evening. Sarah drifted between sleep and wakefulness, her dreams vivid with images of her grandmother gathering plants, showing a young Sarah how to identify healing from harm, sustenance from poison. In one dream particularly clear, Her grandmother placed hands on Sarah's swollen belly and spoke Cherokee words of blessing. "The strongest women birth in the hardest circumstances," she said, her voice clearer than Sarah had remembered it. "You come from those women." Through the worst of the fever, Sarah maintained her routine. Small sips of the bitter tea every hours, cool cloths on her forehead, monitoring her temperature. The baby's movements returned gradually, each kick a profound relief. By dawn of the second day, her fever had broken. Sarah woke drenched in sweat, but clearer-headed, the infection retreating before the combined forces of her immune system and her grandmother's knowledge. She touched the worn herbal manual on her bedside table, a new appreciation for its wisdom filling her. "Thank you, grandmother," she whispered to the empty cabin. The mountain wind seemed to answer, whistling gently through the trees outside her window. Sarah made fresh tea, this time adding honey to the bitter mixture. She drank it, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, feeling the baby move with renewed vigor inside her. Two lives, sustained by knowledge, passed through women's hands across generations. On this mountain, in this moment, ancient wisdom had proven as essential as any modern medicine. The fever had broken, but weakness lingered in Sarah's limbs as she drifted between sleep and waking. Outside, the storm had returned with renewed fury, wind howling around the cabin corners like a living thing. Inside, the wood stove's warmth wrapped around her like a cocoon, inviting deeper rest. "Just for a little while," she murmured, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The infection had taken more from her than she cared to admit. Sleep came like a tide, pulling her under into vivid dreams. She walked through summer forests, the mountain alive with color and sound. Birds called overhead, and wildflowers carpeted the ground beneath her feet. Her body felt light, unburdened by pregnancy or illness. "You're pushing yourself too hard," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned, heart leaping in her chest. David stood there exactly as she remembered him. Tall and steady, sun-browned face creased with smile lines, eyes the color of the summer sky. "You're not real," she said, even as her hand reached for him. He smiled, taking her outstretched fingers in his. His touch felt warm, solid. "Does it matter?" They walked together through her dreamscape, the forest shifting around them. The summer scene gave way to autumn, leaves turning gold and crimson overhead. Time compressed and expanded strangely, as it does in dreams. "The baby," David said, stopping beside a mountain stream. "Our daughter." Sarah's hand went instinctively to her belly, flat in the dream. "How do you know it's a girl?" His smile deepened, revealing the dimple she had loved. "Some things you just know." He knelt beside the water, gesturing for her to join him. "Look." The stream's surface reflected not their faces, but a scene from elsewhere. Their cabin in the depths of winter, a small cradle beside the wood stove, tiny hands reaching upward. "You'll make it," David said, certainty in his voice. "But you need help." "I'm alone," Sarah replied, the dream logic allowing her to state simple facts without emotion. "No." David shook his head. "You've never been alone on this mountain. My people have lived here for generations. They're still here." The dream shifted again. They stood on the cabin porch, but it was different, newer looking, as it had been when David's grandfather built it. An elderly Native American woman worked nearby, weaving something between her weathered hands. "My grandmother," David explained. "She knew you were coming someday. She prepared how?" Sarah asked, watching the old woman's deft fingers create intricate patterns from willow branches and sinew. "Look in the north wall," David said. "Behind the storage shelves. There's a space." The dream began dissolving at the edges, the figures blurring. Sarah felt the pull back toward waking, resisted it desperately. "Don't go," she pleaded, reaching for David's fading form. "Remember the north wall," his voice echoed, as the dream collapsed around her. "And make a dream catcher for our daughter." Sarah woke with a gasp, her hand clutching empty air. The cabin stood silent around her. The storm momentarily abated. Her cheeks were wet with tears. She didn't remember shedding. "Just a dream," she whispered, though it had felt more real than any dream before. Her body ached with the hollowness of David's absence. The baby kicked vigorously, as if responding to her emotional state. Sarah placed both hands on her belly, drawing comfort from the movement. "Your dad says you're a girl," she told the active presence within. "We'll see if he's right." Despite her rational mind's insistence that it was merely a fever dream, Sarah found herself drawn to the cabin's north wall. Storage shelves lined it from floor to ceiling, filled with practical necessities for mountain living. Moving with care, still weak from illness, Sarah began emptying the lowest shelf. Canned goods, tools, winter gear, all carefully set aside. When the shelf was bare, she ran her fingers along the rough wood, seeking anything unusual. Near the bottom right corner, her fingertips detected a subtle difference in the wood grain. A small section, barely noticeable, felt smoother than the surrounding planks. Sarah pressed against it experimentally. The panel gave way, revealing a small cache built into the wall itself. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oiled leather, preserved from moisture and time. With trembling hands, Sarah unwrapped it. The contents made her breath catch. A small medicine pouch, decorated with intricate beadwork, packets of dried plants labeled in faded handwriting, a hunting knife with a bone handle, and a partially completed dream catcher. Willow formed into a perfect circle, with sinew ready for weaving the web. Beneath these treasures lay a yellowed envelope. Inside, a letter written in careful script, "For the woman who carries the future of this cabin. May these tools serve you when the mountain tests your strength." The dream catcher remains unfinished because each mother must complete it for her own child. "Weave protection with love and intention." It was signed simply Margaret Blackfeather Miller, 1973, David's grandmother, the woman from her dream. Sarah held the dream catcher hoop, its simple willow circle, somehow connecting her to generations past. Outside, the wind had calmed completely, the storm pausing as if in acknowledgement. "Thank you," she whispered, to David, to his grandmother, to the mountain itself. That night, by lamplight, Sarah's fingers worked the sinew through the willow hoop, creating the intricate web that would hang above her child's cradle. With each crossing of the threads, she wove her hopes, her determination, and the collective strength of the women who had survived this mountain before her. The hand-cranked radio crackled to life, reluctantly, its ancient speaker protesting with bursts of static. Sarah turned the crank methodically, building the charge necessary to power the device. After the satellite phone died completely, this radio had become her only connection to the outside world, a tenuous link at best. 32 days had passed since the storm began. Sarah had marked each one in her journal with meticulous notes on weather conditions, food consumption, and the baby's movements. Her neat handwriting had grown slightly more erratic as her pregnancy advanced, her belly now so large it was difficult to reach the table comfortably. The calendar indicated mid-October, though the landscape outside suggested deep winter. Snow had accumulated to the windowsills on the north side of the cabin. The temperature rarely rose above freezing, even during brief periods of sunshine. "Let's see what the world is up to, little one," Sarah said, adjusting the radio's tuner. Static gave way to fragments of voices as she carefully rotated the dial. Most frequencies yielded nothing, the mountain's mass blocking signals that might otherwise reach. Finally, she caught the familiar voice of the regional emergency broadcast system. "Repeat, this is not a test. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has issued a space weather alert. A severe geomagnetic storm is currently affecting communications across the northern hemisphere. The coronal mass ejection, or CME, that struck Earth's magnetic field at 0437 hours has been classified as a G4 event on the geomagnetic storm scale, Sarah leaned closer to the radio, increasing her cranking pace as the voice began to fade. Expect widespread disruption to satellite communications, GPS systems and power grids. In remote areas, emergency communications may be unavailable for 72 to 96 hours. Search and rescue operations in the following regions will be severely limited until equipment functionality can be restored. The broadcast listed counties and mountain ranges, including her own. Sarah's heart sank as the implications became clear. Even if someone were looking for her, their equipment would be useless in the current conditions. The radio signal deteriorated into unintelligible static. Sarah cranked harder, desperate for more information, but the broadcast was lost. She continued through the frequencies, finding only static or fragments too brief to comprehend. Setting the radio down, Sarah moved to the window. The sky appeared normal, cloudy and grey, typical of the ongoing winter pattern. No visible aurora that might indicate the geomagnetic storm raging in the upper atmosphere. Yet somewhere up there, solar particles were bombarding Earth's magnetic field, creating havoc with the technology she might have depended on for rescue. 4 days without search capabilities, she said, calculating mentally. Plus however many days the storm continues after that. The baby shifted position, a rolling movement visible even through Sarah's thick sweater. She placed her hand on the spot, feeling a foot or elbow press against her palm. "I know," she acknowledged. "This complicates things." Her due date was approaching, approximately 7 weeks away, according to her calculations. First pregnancies often went late, but the physical stress of her situation might trigger earlier labor. The window for potential rescue before birth was narrow. Sarah retrieved her journal and added a new entry. Day 32. Solar flare, affecting communications, search and rescue operations, suspended for at least 4 days. Need to prepare for possibility of unassisted birth. The words written in black and white made the situation undeniable. She might face childbirth alone, in a remote cabin, during the worst winter in decades. The thought sent a cold tremor through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. Sarah moved to the bookshelf and pulled down the pregnancy guides she'd brought from town months ago. She'd read them before, of course, but now she opened them with new urgency, turning to the chapters on labor, delivery, and complications. The clinical language described a process that seemed simultaneously unnatural and terrifying. Without medical support, certain complications could prove fatal for her, the baby, or both. The books offered emergency protocols, but many relied on equipment and medications she didn't possess. Sarah closed the books and turned instead to the items from the wall cache. Margaret Blackfeather Miller's legacy. The dried herbs included several traditionally used during childbirth. Raspberry leaf for strengthening the uterus, shepherd's purse for hemorrhage control, motherwort for reducing anxiety. Her grandmother had taught her that women had been giving birth without modern medicine for millennia. Native women on this very mountain had delivered generations of healthy children using knowledge passed from mother to daughter. That wisdom had been preserved in the medicine pouch and in her grandmother's teachings. "We'll manage," Sarah told her unborn child, with more confidence than she felt. "Between modern knowledge and traditional wisdom, we have options." She returned to the radio, cranking it again in hopes of catching further updates. The solar flare presented yet another obstacle, but Sarah had long since accepted that this winter would be a series of challenges to overcome. Each one survived, brought her closer to spring, closer to safe passage down the mountain with her child. Outside, snow began falling again, adding another layer to the white blanket that isolated her from the world. Inside, a woman made peace with the growing certainty that the most important event of her life would happen without witnesses or assistance, just her own strength and knowledge against nature's indifferent power. Sarah spread clean towels across her bed, arranging them with methodical precision. Beside them she placed a stack of freshly laundered cotton cloths, boiled for sterilization and dried by the wood stove. On the bedside table, a collection of tools gleamed in the afternoon light: scissors, clean string, a bulb syringe, all carefully sterilized in boiling water. "Preparation is half the battle," she murmured, reciting her father's favorite phrase, 34 weeks pregnant now, with just over a month until her due date. Time to prepare for the increasingly likely scenario of giving birth alone. The solar flare had confirmed what she'd suspected for weeks. No help would reach her before spring. From the bookshelf, Sarah retrieved her pregnancy guides and medical reference books. Paging through dog-eared sections marked with notes, she'd read them so many times that certain passages were committed to memory, but she reviewed them again, focusing on the practical aspects of unassisted childbirth. "Clean hands, clean environment, minimal intervention," she recited, summarizing the key point. The books described clinical settings with sterilized instruments and emergency backup. Sarah would have a cabin with wood heat, melted snow for water, and whatever supplies she could improvise. The contrast was stark, but not insurmountable. She picked up the scissors she'd sterilized for cutting the umbilical cord. They were David's fishing scissors, designed for monofilament line, but sharp enough for their new purpose. The string beside them was cotton twine, boiled repeatedly to remove any contaminants. Not ideal, but functional. Sarah opened a wooden box containing items from Margaret Blackfeather Miller's cache. The traditional birthing supplies included dried herbs, a ceremonial stone for focusing energy during labor, and a small deerskin pouch filled with soft moss traditionally used as a natural absorbent. "Modern meets traditional," Sarah said, arranging these items alongside her medically oriented supplies. From the kitchen, she brought a pot of raspberry leaf tea, known to tone the uterus and prepare it for labor. The bitter liquid had become a daily ritual, along with gentle stretching exercises modified for her advancing pregnancy. The baby kicked vigorously as she moved around the cabin, perhaps responding to her increased activity. Sarah paused, hand on her belly tracking the movements. "That's right, stay active in there," she encouraged. "Head down when the time comes." The cabin had become increasingly cramped as Sarah rearranged furniture to create a birthing space. The area near the wood stove, the warmest spot, now featured her bed, a chair for laboring, and clear paths to both the door and bathroom. Supplies were organized for easy access during different stages of labor. Sarah picked up a notebook where she'd been documenting the baby's movements, her own physical changes and potential warning signs to monitor. The methodical record-keeping provided some sense of control in a situation largely beyond her influence. "Knowledge is power," she reminded herself, another of her father's maxims, but knowledge also brought awareness of what could go wrong: breech presentation, shoulder dystocia, postpartum hemorrhage, umbilical cord complications. The potential dangers formed a litany in her mind, each with minimal intervention options in her isolated circumstances. Sarah closed the notebook and moved to the window. Outside, the world remained blanketed in snow, the landscape both beautiful and intimidating in its isolation. No neighbors within miles, no way to call for help, no road access until spring. "Just us," she told her unborn child, watching her breath fog the cold glass. In the reflection, she could see the dream catcher she'd completed hanging above the small handmade cradle. Its intricate web seemed to capture the afternoon light, the feathers and beads moving slightly with air currents from the wood stove. Sarah turned back to her birthing supplies, adding one final item: a sealed envelope containing a letter she'd written the previous night. Instructions for whoever might find them, if the birth went catastrophically wrong. Locations of important documents. A message for her sister. A letter to her child. Acknowledging the possibility of her own death had been difficult but necessary. Sarah placed the envelope in a drawer, where it would be easily found, then returned to her preparations with renewed determination. She picked up a small mirror, another essential tool for an unassisted birth, and positioned it where she could use it to check her progress during labor. The mechanics of delivering her own baby would be challenging, requiring flexibility and calm she hoped she possessed. "We've come this far together," she told the active presence within her. A few more weeks of growth for you, then we'll meet face to face. Sarah sat in the rocking chair beside the wood stove, hands resting on her rounded belly. The preparations were as complete as possible, given her limitations. What remained now was waiting, continued planning, and the mental fortitude to face whatever came. The baby shifted position, a series of small movements followed by what felt like a tiny hand or foot pressing outward. Sarah smiled despite her concerns. "I promise you this much," she whispered. "You are more prepared for than any baby in this family's history." Outside, a raven called, its harsh cry carrying through the clear air. Inside, a woman continued rocking, rehearsing in her mind the steps that would bring a new life into the world. Alone on a mountain in the depth of winter, armed with nothing but knowledge, improvised tools, and unshakable determination. The sound woke Sarah from a fitful sleep, a deep, distant rumble like summer thunder, but wrong for the season. She lay still, listening as it grew louder, feeling it vibrate through the cabin's timbers. Her hand instinctively moved to protect her belly as recognition dawned. Avalanche. She pushed herself upright, awkward with the weight of 8 months of pregnancy, and moved to the window. In the dim pre-dawn light, she could see it, a massive river of snow cascading down the eastern slope, taking trees and boulders in its path. The main force was channeled through a gully 1/2 mile from the cabin, but even from this distance, the power was terrifying. "Too close," she whispered, calculating the avalanche's trajectory. It would miss the cabin, but Sarah's breath caught as she realized its path. The woodshed, her primary firewood supply, sat directly in the danger zone. She dressed quickly, pulling layers over her stretched thermal underwear. At 36 weeks pregnant, every movement had become deliberate, her balance shifted by the child growing within. The baby stirred, perhaps sensing her agitation. "It's okay," she murmured, "just a small problem to solve." Outside, the temperature had dropped overnight, the air sharp and brittle in her lungs. Sarah strapped her snowshoes on with difficulty, her fingers clumsy with cold and her belly making it nearly impossible to reach her feet. The avalanche had stopped, leaving an otherworldly scene in its wake. Where there had once been pristine forest, a swath of destruction stretched down the mountainside. Trees snapped like toothpicks, massive snow deposits piled 20 feet high. The sound of settling snow and creaking wood carried through the still air. Sarah moved carefully along the edge of the cabin clearing, using her walking stick to test stability with each step. The main woodshed stood intact, but perilously close to the avalanche's edge. Already she could see snow encroaching on the structure, putting immense pressure on its walls. A sharp pain gripped her lower back as she surveyed the scene. Sarah paused, breathing deeply until it passed. Just the strain of movement, she told herself. Not labor. It was the woodshed contained enough split logs to last the remaining winter, assuming it didn't collapse under the weight of displaced snow. Sarah needed to secure at least a portion of that supply immediately. She opened the shed door, assessing the situation. The far wall was already buckling inward from the pressure. The entire structure could give way without warning. Working quickly, Sarah began filling her sled with wood, stacking it carefully to maximize the load. "One trip at a time," she said, pacing herself. The exertion made her breathe hard, vapor clouds forming with each exhale. Pulling the loaded sled through deep snow while heavily pregnant was a brutally difficult task. Sarah leaned into the harness, using her body weight as counterbalance, careful not to strain her abdomen. The sled moved in jerks and starts, progress frustratingly slow. Halfway back to the cabin, another pain seized her, sharper this time, radiating from her back around to her front. Sarah froze, counting seconds until it released. 30 seconds. Too long and too intense to ignore. "Not now," she pleaded, looking back at the precarious woodshed. "We need this wood," she continued, dragging the sled, moving with renewed urgency. The first load was safely stacked beside the cabin when she heard it, a groaning crack as the woodshed began to give way. Sarah watched in dismay as the roof sagged, the walls folding inward under the inexorable pressure of tons of displaced snow. There was no time for caution now. Sarah returned to the collapsing structure, forcing her exhausted body forward. She managed to drag a second sled load from the shed before the building shuddered ominously. "That's enough," she decided, eyeing the increasingly unstable structure. "We leave the rest." As if punctuating her words, another contraction gripped her, this one bringing her to her knees in the snow. Sarah gritted her teeth, riding through the wave of pain, counting again. 45 seconds. 8 minutes since the last one. "False labor," she insisted between gasped breaths. Braxton Hicks. Exertion. The rational part of her mind disagreed. These were too regular, too painful. The baby wasn't due for another month, but stress and physical strain could trigger early labor. The avalanche and her desperate effort to save essential supplies might have been the catalyst. She needed to get back to the cabin. Sarah abandoned the half-filled second sled and began trudging through the snow, each step deliberate. The pain returned twice more during the short journey, confirming her fears. Inside the cabin, Sarah shed her outer layers with shaking hands. She retrieved her journal and noted the time and duration of each contraction. The pattern was unmistakable. "This is happening," she acknowledged, fear and determination mingling in her voice. A glance at the woodpile, now significantly smaller than her winter calculations required, added another layer of concern. If the baby came now, weeks early, they would be facing the coldest part of winter with inadequate supplies. Sarah moved to her prepared birthing area, mentally reviewing emergency protocols for premature labor. Stop the contractions if possible. Conserve energy. Monitor for complications. She brewed the herbal tea Margaret's supplies had indicated might slow early labor. Black haw bark and cramp bark, bitter remedies that frontier women had used for generations. As she drank, Sarah practiced the breathing technique she'd rehearsed for weeks. Outside, the collapsed woodshed disappeared beneath the settling snow. Inside, a woman fought her body's signals, willing her child to remain sheltered within a few weeks longer. Another contraction seized her, stronger than before. Sarah gripped the edge of the table, riding through the pain, feeling her body's inexorable preparation for birth, despite her desperate wish for delay. "Not yet," she whispered to her unborn child. "Please, not yet. We need more time." But nature, as always on this mountain, would follow its own timetable, indifferent to human plans or prayers. The contractions had subsided by nightfall. Sarah sat by the window, wrapped in blankets, watching darkness settle over the transformed landscape. The herbal remedies, combined with hours of rest, had quieted her rebellious body. False labor or perhaps early warnings successfully heeded. A dress rehearsal, she told her unborn child, feeling relieved movements within. But not opening night. The brass telescope, a gift from David on their first anniversary, sat on the windowsill. Sarah often used it to track weather patterns forming over distant peaks or to watch wildlife in the meadow below. Tonight, she lifted it idly, scanning the moonlit terrain more from habit than purpose. The silvered landscape gleamed under a waxing moon, the avalanche's path etched like a scar across the eastern slope. Sarah panned slowly, following the destruction to its terminus, where broken trees and displaced boulders created a chaotic jumble. A flicker of movement caught her attention. She adjusted the focus, steadying the telescope against the window frame. There at the edge of the debris field, something moved with deliberate purpose, too large for a fox or coyote, too methodical for a deer. Sarah's pulse quickened as the figure resolved in her viewfinder, a person struggling through knee-deep snow, periodically stopping to rest. "Impossible," she whispered. "No one should be on the mountain." The roads remained impassable, the conditions lethal to all but the most experienced mountaineers. Yet the evidence continued its labored progress across her field of view. A solitary human figure, moving with the telltale awkwardness of exhaustion, occasionally stumbling but pressing onward. Sarah calculated the stranger's position, approximately 2 miles downslope, heading in a direction that would miss the cabin entirely unless they changed course. At their current pace in such conditions, nightfall would find them exposed on the mountainside. A death sentence in these temperatures, she bit her lip considering options. Her father's rifle hung above the door. Safety demanded caution with any stranger. Yet leaving someone to freeze went against everything she believed. Decision made, Sarah moved to the door and removed her father's rifle. Outside, the air burned cold in her lungs as she loaded a single shell and fired upward. The sound cracked across the valley, echoing off distant peaks. She waited 30 seconds and fired again. Through the telescope, she watched the figure stop, turning toward the sound. Sarah retrieved the emergency signal mirror from her pack and caught the moonlight, flashing it in the recognized distress pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The figure changed direction, now moving deliberately toward the cabin. Sarah returned inside to prepare, both for rescue and defense. She stoked the wood stove for extra warmth, set water to boil, and laid out dry clothing that might fit a stranger. Then she reloaded the rifle and placed it within easy reach. An hour passed before she heard it, the crunch of snowshoes approaching, followed by a tentative knock. Sarah positioned herself carefully, rifle not quite aimed, but ready. "Who's there?" she called through the door. "My name is Jacob Redhorse," came the reply, voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I'm a search and rescue volunteer from Pinecrest Station." Sarah frowned. The name triggered recognition, Elena's boyfriend, the search and rescue worker. But why would he be alone on the mountain? "Why are you here?" she demanded. "Your sister sent me to check on you after the radio reports of the avalanche. The team couldn't get equipment up the mountain because of the solar flare interference, so I came alone." Sarah processed this, suspicion warring with desperate hope for human contact. "Step back from the door," she instructed. "Keep your hands visible." She opened the door cautiously, rifle ready. The man standing on her porch looked half frozen, his dark hair crusted with ice, his weathered face reddened from cold. Native American, mid-30s, wearing professional-grade winter gear now caked with snow. "Elena showed me your picture," he said, teeth chattering. "You're Sarah Miller. I promised her I'd find you." The details matched, but caution kept the rifle steady. "What's my sister's dog's name?" "Bartleby," he answered without hesitation. "An English bulldog with a crooked tail. You gave him to her for her 30th birthday." Sarah lowered the rifle and stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." Jacob staggered into the cabin's warmth, his movements clumsy with cold. Sarah helped him remove his outer layers, noting the quality of his gear, top-of-line equipment that had nonetheless been pushed to its limits. "How did you get up here?" she asked, guiding him to the chair nearest the wood stove. "The roads are completely blocked," came up the Eastern Ridge Trail. He explained, voice still rough. "Had to abandon my snowmobile 10 miles back when the fuel line froze. Been on foot since yesterday afternoon." Sarah handed him a mug of hot tea laced with honey. "That's insane. You could have died. Your sister was convinced you were in trouble." His dark eyes took in her pregnant form. "Seems she was right to worry." "I'm managing," Sarah replied stiffly, uncomfortable with the assessment. Jacob sipped the tea, color gradually returning to his face. "The avalanche missed the cabin." "Yes, but took out my woodshed. I've salvaged what I could." She paused. "You said you're with Search and Rescue." He nodded. 8 years with Pinecrest, specialized in winter operations. Also worked as a wilderness paramedic before that. Sarah felt a flutter of hope. Medical training, full wilderness first responder certification, plus field medical experience. His gaze sharpened. "Are you hurt?" "No," Sarah said, hand moving instinctively to her belly. "But I had some contractions today after moving wood. They've stopped now." Jacob set down his mug. How far along are you? 36 weeks. He nodded slowly. Not ideal timing, but not catastrophic either. Any other symptoms? The clinical assessment was oddly reassuring after months of self-diagnosis. Sarah detailed her pregnancy progress, the false labor episode, her preparations for possible delivery. You've been thorough, Jacob acknowledged. But a first birth alone, he left the implications unspoken. I don't have much choice, Sarah pointed out, unless you brought a helicopter in your pocket. Jacob smiled slightly, revealing a chipped front tooth. No helicopter, but I did bring a satellite communicator. Sarah's heart leapt. That works despite the solar flare. His smile faded. It did until the avalanche. Got damaged in a fall. I've been trying to repair it, but I need parts. The brief hope deflated. They were still isolated, just no longer alone. Sarah studied the stranger in her cabin, a connection to the outside world, a trained medical professional, potentially an ally in the weeks ahead, or another mouth to feed, another life to worry about. You can stay tonight, she said finally. Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps. Jacob nodded, understanding the cautious acceptance. Thank you. For what it's worth, I promised Elena I'd get you both safely down this mountain. You and the baby, he clarified, gesturing to her belly. I intend to keep that promise. Sarah didn't respond, her thoughts already calculating revised survival odds with this unexpected variable. Outside, darkness had fully claimed the mountain, the temperature dropping toward bitter extremes. Inside, two strangers assessed one another by firelight, united by circumstance, but divided by the natural caution of solitary survivors. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows as Sarah studied the map spread across the kitchen table. Jacob stood opposite her, tracing a route with his finger. I came up through here, he said, indicating a narrow passage between two peaks. Following game trails, the usual access roads are completely snowed in. Sarah frowned, scrutinizing the path he'd described. Something didn't add up. That's a 15-mile detour from the ranger station, she noted. Why not take the western approach? It's more sheltered from avalanche risk. Jacob hesitated, just a fraction of a second, before answering. Storm damage blocked the western trails, trees down everywhere. Sarah watched his face carefully. After a night's rest, the stranger seemed less desperate, more calculated in his movements and words. Something about his explanation felt rehearsed. You said Elena sent you, she probed, keeping her tone conversational. When exactly did you speak with her? 10 days ago, Jacob replied, rolling up the map. Just after the first reports of the avalanche activity in this region. The solar flare disrupted communications 4 days ago, Sarah said. Yet you arrived yesterday. That's a lot of time spent climbing. Jacob turned toward the wood stove, adding another log to the fire. I got delayed. Had to backtrack twice when routes were impassable. Sarah moved to the cupboard, retrieving 2 mugs for morning tea. Her back was to Jacob as she asked, and Elena, how is she coping with all this? Worried sick about you, obviously, Jacob answered, especially with the baby coming. Sarah set the mugs down with deliberate care. Funny thing about my sister, she said, turning to face him. She doesn't know I'm pregnant. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Jacob's expression shifted from surprise to wariness. You never told her? He asked finally. I intended to, after I'd passed the first trimester. Then the storm hit. Communications went down. Sarah crossed her arms. So I'm curious how you knew. Jacob's posture changed subtly, becoming less guarded. He sighed, seeming to reach a decision. Your sister didn't send me, he admitted. At least, not directly. Then who did? Nobody sent me. I came looking for you on my own. Sarah took an instinctive step back, her hand finding the kitchen knife on the counter behind her. Why? Jacob noticed the movement, but made no attempt to approach. I'm really with search and rescue, he said, pulling his official identification from his pocket and placing it on the table. But I'm here because of David. The name hit her like a physical blow. David? she whispered. My husband? Jacob nodded. We were friends at university, roommates for 2 years. Sarah stared at him, searching for any resemblance to the photographs David had shown her of his college days. There had been a Native American student in some of them, usually in the background. He never mentioned you, she said. We lost touch after graduation, reconnected about 18 months ago, shortly before his accident. Jacob's voice softened. He talked about you constantly. This cabin, your life together. Sarah's grip tightened on the knife. Prove it. Jacob met her gaze steadily. The east bedroom window sticks in humid weather. David carved your initials inside the main support beam during renovations. He was allergic to strawberries, but ate them anyway because you loved them. Details only someone close to David would know. Sarah felt her certainty wavering. Why are you here now? She demanded. When the first major storm hit, I checked the county records. Your name was on the no evacuation list. Residents who refused to leave despite warnings. Jacob gestured to her pregnant form. I had no idea about the baby. I just knew David's wife was alone on a mountain that was about to get hammered by the worst winter in decades. Sarah slowly placed the knife back on the counter. So you what? Decided to mount a one-man rescue operation? Something like that. Jacob looked away. David saved my life once, during a climbing expedition that went bad. I owed him. The pieces were falling into place, but not quite fitting. And my sister? How does she factor in? I did contact Elena before I left. Told her I was a friend of David's and was heading up to check on you. She gave me details about the cabin's location, but communications went down before I could update her. Sarah moved to the window, needing space to process this revelation. Outside, the snow continued its relentless accumulation, another few inches since nightfall. You climbed a mountain in winter conditions, alone, to check on your dead friend's wife. The skepticism in her voice was unmistakable. Jacob didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. David was more than a friend to me. Sarah turned sharply. Meaning? We were close, very close. Before he met you. Jacob held her gaze. He chose you and I respected that. But I promised him once that if anything ever happened to him, I'd make sure you were okay. Understanding dawned, the nature of their relationship, the depth of the connection, Jacob's seemingly irrational determination to reach her. David never told me, she said softly. He wouldn't have. That chapter was closed. Jacob looked down at his hands. But promises don't end when someone dies. Sarah leaned against the windowsill, processing this new reality. The stranger in her cabin wasn't a stranger to David. He carried pieces of her husband's past she'd never known. Parts of David's life that existed before her. That satellite communicator you mentioned, she said finally. It's really broken. Jacob nodded. Unfortunately, yes. Damaged in a fall during the climb. I've been trying to fix it, but I need parts. So we're still isolated. Yes. But you're no longer alone. Jacob gestured toward her belly. And I do have medical training, wilderness first responder, like I said. That part was true. Sarah studied him, this man who had risked death to fulfill a promise to someone they both had loved. Trust didn't come easily after months of self-reliance, but the reality of her situation remained unchanged. A baby coming, winter deepening, resources dwindling. Have you ever delivered a baby? She asked bluntly. Jacob's expression remained serious. Assisted with 2 emergency deliveries during my paramedic rotations. Neither in conditions like this, but the principles are the same. It wasn't ideal, but it was more experience than she had. Sarah nodded slowly, coming to a decision. We'll figure this out together then, she said, for David. Outside, snow continued falling on the isolated cabin. Inside, an unexpected alliance formed between 2 people connected by absence, both driven by love for someone who existed now only in memory. The rhythmic scrape of sandpaper against wood filled the cabin as Sarah smoothed the curved edge of the cradle's headboard. Curls of pine shavings gathered around her feet, their fresh scent mixing with the ever-present aroma of wood smoke. Outside, another blizzard raged, the fourth in the 2 weeks since Jacob's arrival. "You're good at that," Jacob observed from where he sat at the table, sorting through medical supplies. "Where did you learn woodworking?" "My father," Sarah replied, running her fingers along the grain to check for rough spots. "He made furniture during winters when guiding work was slow." The cradle was taking shape, a simple design with rockers carved from a single piece of pine. Sarah had started it days before Jacob arrived, working in stolen moments between survival tasks. Now, with another set of hands to share the burden of daily chores, she could focus on completing it. David was hopeless with tools, Jacob remarked, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Remember when he tried to build that bookcase?" Sarah looked up, still unused to these casual mentions of shared memories. "It collapsed the moment he put a book on it," she said. "He was so embarrassed. He was good at other things."
Yes.
The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence. Over the past 2 weeks, they'd established a cautious rhythm, sharing stories of David like offerings, each revelation a small bridge between them. Jacob turned his attention back to the medical supplies, organizing them by function. "I've inventoried everything useful for the birth," he said. "We're in decent shape for basic delivery, but limited if complications arise." Sarah set down her sandpaper. "Define complications, the usual concerns, positioning issues, cord problems, excessive bleeding." Jacob's tone remained clinical, professional. "Without equipment for monitoring, we'll be relying on manual assessment and your body's signals." "And if something goes seriously wrong?" Sarah asked, voicing the fear that had been her constant companion. Jacob met her gaze directly. "Then we improvise with what we have, and hope it's enough." His honesty was both terrifying and oddly comforting. No false reassurances, just shared acknowledgement of their reality. Sarah pushed herself up from her chair with effort, one hand supporting her lower back. At 38 weeks pregnant, every movement had become an exercise in negotiation with her changed body. "Show me what you know," she said, moving to the table. "Walk me through a normal delivery." Jacob began arranging supplies in sequence. Clean cloths, scissors, string for the umbilical cord, bulb syringe for clearing the baby's airways. As he explained each step of the process, his hands moved with confident efficiency, muscle memory from his medical training. "After the head emerges, I'll check for the cord around the neck," he demonstrated with gestures. "Then support the head as it rotates to deliver the shoulders, one at a time. The rest of the body usually follows quickly." Sarah listened intently, mentally cataloging each detail. "And my part?" "Your body knows what to do," Jacob assured her. "First-time labor typically lasts 12 to 18 hours. Contractions start mild and irregular, then establish a pattern as they intensify." "I need to practice positions," Sarah decided. "Show me the option." For the next hour, Jacob guided her through different birthing positions, standing, squatting on hands and knees, semi-reclining. They discussed the advantages of each, adapting to the limited space and resources of the cabin. "Squatting uses gravity to help," Jacob explained, "but it's tiring to maintain. We can rig support ropes from that beam if needed." The practical, methodical approach helped transform abstract fear into manageable tasks. Sarah felt her anxiety receding, replaced by determined focus. "I think I prefer this," she said, demonstrating a kneeling position leaning against the bed. "It feels most natural." Jacob nodded approvingly. "Good. We'll prepare for that primary position and have backups ready." A sharp kick from the baby made Sarah wince mid-demonstration. She placed her hand over the spot, feeling the firm outline of what might be a foot or elbow. "Active today," Jacob observed. "Always," Sarah replied with a small smile. "Especially at night. Like they're practicing for when they'll keep me up after birth." "They?" Jacob raised an eyebrow. "You don't know the gender?" "No medical ultrasounds up here," Sarah shrugged. "Though David thought it would be a girl." Jacob looked surprised. "He did. He said he had a dream about a daughter, Sarah explained. I never knew if he really believed it or just liked the idea. He was intuitive about some things, Jacob said thoughtfully, returning medical supplies to their organized boxes. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, snow accumulating in drifts that now reached above the windowsills on the north side. The isolation was complete. No rescue possible, no evacuation option. The baby would be born here, in this cabin, witnessed only by the two people who had loved its father. Sarah returned to the cradle, lifting the nearly completed frame. I need to finish this before. Let me help, Jacob offered, reaching for the toolbox. 4 hands will make it go faster. Together they worked through the afternoon, sanding, fitting, securing joints. Sarah directed the technical aspects, while Jacob provided the strength her pregnant body lacked. By evening, the cradle stood complete beside the wood stove, ready for its tiny occupant. It's beautiful, Jacob said, running his hand along the smooth headboard. David would have loved it. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. David should have been here, should have built this cradle himself, should have witnessed his child's birth. The unfairness of his absence hit her anew. I miss him, she said simply. Every day, Jacob agreed, the shared grief, a tangible presence between them. Later, as darkness settled completely and the storm continued its siege, Sarah sat by the window writing in her journal. Jacob moved quietly around the cabin, checking locks, banking the fire for the night, respecting her private moment. Jacob, up, she said suddenly, looking up from her writing. If something happens to me during the birth, promise you'll get the baby down the mountain when weather allows. He stopped what he was doing, turning to face her. Nothing's going to happen to you. Promise me anyway, Sarah insisted. My sister would raise the child well. Jacob crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, his expression solemn. But I also promise to do everything humanly possible to ensure you're both alive to make that journey together. Sarah nodded, accepting both promises equally. She returned to her journal, adding final preparations to her delivery plan. Outside, the blizzard began to wane, snow giving way to clearing skies and plummeting temperatures. Inside, a woman and a man, prepared for the arrival of new life, bound together by a shared love for someone gone and a shared commitment to the future he'd never see. The first contraction woke Sarah at 2:17 a.m., a tightening band that wrapped around her lower back and spread forward. She lay still, counting seconds until it released. 1 minute, 12 seconds. Not just practice this time. Outside, the worst blizzard of the season raged, wind screaming around the cabin corners like a living entity. The temperature had plummeted to 30 below, cold so intense it turned breath to ice crystals and froze exposed skin within minutes. Sarah eased herself out of bed, movements deliberate in the dim light of banked coals. No need to wake Jacob yet. First babies took time, and she wanted these early hours for herself, a private communion with a child preparing to enter the world. She paced the cabin's main room, one hand trailing along furniture for balance, the other resting on her belly. The next contraction arrived 11 minutes later, slightly stronger but manageable. Sarah breathed through it as she'd practiced, visualizing her body opening, making way. By dawn, the pattern had established itself, contractions every 8 minutes, lasting nearly 90 seconds. Sarah had built the fire higher, laid out supplies, and prepared herself mentally. It was time. Jacob, she called softly to the small alcove where he slept. He woke instantly, years of rescue training evident in his immediate alertness. Is it happening? Yes, since about 2. Jacob checked his watch. 4 hours active. Where are we at? 8 minutes apart. 90 seconds duration. Intensify. He nodded, immediately shifting into the role they'd prepared for. No panic, no unnecessary conversation, just the practiced moves of their birthing plan. Let's check your progress, he said, washing his hands thoroughly at the basin. Sarah positioned herself on the bed, appreciating the clinical detachment with which Jacob performed the examination. His medical training superseded any personal awkwardness between them. "About 4 centimeters dilated," he reported. "Good progress, but still early. First stage labor. Try to rest between contractions if you can." The storm intensified as morning stretched into afternoon. Sarah moved between positions, walking when possible, kneeling against the bed during contractions, occasionally resting in the rocking chair. Jacob remained a constant presence, timing contractions, offering water, applying counter-pressure to her lower back when the pain peaked. "Tell me about the worst rescue you ever did," Sarah requested during a brief respite. Distraction helped. Stories even more so. Jacob considered while preparing a cool cloth for her forehead. "Climber with a compound fracture on devil's thumb." He began. Storm coming in, darkness falling, and 3,000 feet of exposure on the west face. His calm voice continued through her next contraction, the story pulling her attention away from the intensifying pressure. This had become their rhythm. Jacob sharing rescue tales during breaks, then falling silent during contractions, counting breaths with her. By late afternoon, the contractions had accelerated to 3 minutes apart. Sarah could no longer talk through them, each wave demanding her complete focus. The pain had transformed from manageable to all-consuming, requiring every technique they'd practiced. "Transition phase," Jacob explained, his voice an anchor in the storm of sensation. "The hardest part, but also means you're getting close." Sarah nodded, sweat dampening her hair despite the winter chill. She had moved to her preferred position, kneeling beside the bed, upper body supported by pillows. Jacob knelt behind her, ready to assist. "I can't," she gasped as a particularly violent contraction seized her. "It's too much." "You can," Jacob countered firmly. "You're the strongest person on this mountain. Your body knows exactly what to do." The next contraction brought a new sensation, an overwhelming urge to push. Sarah's body bore down involuntarily, a primal force beyond conscious control. "I need to push," she managed between ragged breaths. Jacob quickly checked her progress. "Fully dilated. Listen to your body. Push when it tells you." What followed seemed both endless and instantaneous, a succession of pushing contractions that blurred together in a haze of exertion and pain. Sarah lost track of time, aware only of Jacob's steady voice guiding her through each push. "The head is crowning," he announced. "I can see dark hair." Sarah gathered her remaining strength, bearing down with fierce determination as Jacob supported the emerging head. "Gentle now," he cautioned. "Small pushes while I check for the cord." His hands moved with practiced efficiency, confirming the umbilical cord was clear. Next contraction, push steadily for the shoulders. Sarah felt the intense pressure, the burning stretch as the widest part of the baby emerged. One final, monumental effort pushed the shoulders through, and then miraculous release as the rest of the body slid free. A moment of breathless silence, then a lusty, indignant cry filled the cabin, rising above even the howling storm outside. "A girl," Jacob announced, his clinical detachment finally breaking as emotion roughened his voice. "You have a daughter, Sarah." He placed the squirming vernix-covered infant on Sarah's chest. Time stopped as Sarah beheld her daughter for the first time. The dark hair, the tiny perfect features, the fierce grip of impossibly small fingers around her own. "Hello," she whispered, tears mingling with sweat. "I've waited so long to meet you." Jacob moved efficiently around them, managing the delivery of the placenta, cutting and tying the cord, wrapping warm blankets around both mother and child. His medical vigilance never wavered, even as wonder softened his features. "She looks like David," he said quietly, watching the newborn root instinctively against Sarah's skin. "Same determined chin." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the overwhelming emotions flooding through her. Joy and grief intertwined inseparably, the miracle of new life alongside the acute absence of the man who should have witnessed it. Outside, the storm began to abate, the wind's howl softening to a moan, and then a wisp. Inside, a different sort of storm had passed, leaving in its wake profound exhaustion and equally profound transformation. "What will you call her?" Jacob asked, settling a fresh blanket around them. Sarah studied her daughter's face, seeing echoes of David in the curve of her brow, the shape of her ears. The name she'd been considering for months suddenly felt right. Margaret, she decided, after David's grandmother, Margaret Elena Miller. "It suits her," Jacob agreed, gently checking the infant's vital signs as she nursed for the first time. In the quiet aftermath, as Sarah drifted between wakefulness and exhausted sleep, she felt a peace unlike any she'd known since losing David. The isolation, the danger, the uncertainty remained, but something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer waiting to survive until spring. Now she was ensuring her daughter would thrive beyond it. As if understanding her thoughts, little Margaret opened eyes the same shade of blue as her father's, regarding Sarah with the solemn, unfocused gaze of the newly born. "We made it," Sarah whispered to her daughter as the storm finally ceased, stars appearing in the clearing night sky beyond frosted windows. "The worst is behind us now." 2 weeks after Margaret's birth, Sarah stood on the cabin porch, the baby secured against her chest in a carrier crafted from deerskin and lined with soft rabbit fur. The morning air still carried winter's bite, but something had changed, a subtle shift in the quality of light, a different scent on the breeze. "It's happening," Jacob said, joining her at the railing. Listen. In the silence between wind gusts, they heard it, the faint, musical dripping of melting snow. Tiny rivulets had formed along the cabin eaves, each drop catching sunlight as it fell. "First real thaw," Sarah confirmed, adjusting Margaret's blanket to shield her from the breeze. "Earlier than expected." Jacob nodded, his gaze scanning the transformed landscape. What had been an unbroken expanse of white now showed patches of emerging terrain, dark spots where thinning snow revealed rocks or tree bases. "The south-facing slope is melting fastest," he observed. "Give it another week of days like this, and the main trail might be passable." Sarah felt conflicting emotions at the prospect, eagerness to reconnect with the world below, yet reluctance to leave the sanctuary where her daughter had entered the world. These past 2 weeks had existed outside of normal time, a cocoon of recovery and bonding untouched by external concerns. "We should prepare," she said finally. "Make a list of what needs to happen before we attempt the descent." Inside, they inventoried supplies for the journey. Jacob spread the topographical map across the table, plotting the safest route down the mountain. Sarah nursed Margaret while listing essential items, the baby carrier, extra blankets, emergency medical supplies, minimal food and water. "We travel light and fast," Jacob advised. 10 miles to the ranger station if we take the direct route. Doable in a day under normal conditions." "These aren't normal conditions," Sarah reminded him. "And I'm still recovering." 2 days then. We'll bring the emergency shelter for an overnight stay." Margaret finished nursing and gazed up at her mother with David's blue eyes, still unfocused but increasingly alert to the world around her. Sarah traced the perfect curve of her daughter's cheek, marveling at the resilience of this tiny being who had entered life in such extraordinary circumstances. "Your first journey," she told the infant softly. "The beginning of many. Over the next days the thaw accelerated. The mountain released winter's grip, reluctantly, surrendering inch by inch to spring's inevitable advance. Snowmelt created temporary streams that carved channels through drifts, exposing earth beneath for the first time in months. Sarah packed methodically, choosing items with care. Photographs of David, the dream catcher she'd completed for Margaret, the journal documenting her mountain pregnancy. Jacob repaired equipment, fashioned a walking staff for Sarah, and reinforced the baby carrier with additional supports. On the morning of departure, Sarah stood in the cabin's center, absorbing final impressions: the wood stove that had preserved their lives, the table where she'd planned her survival, the cradle David's grandmother had unknowingly prepared for his child. The space felt imprinted with memory, every corner holding some moment of fear, determination or joy from the extraordinary winter. "We can return in summer," Jacob said, reading her thoughts. Bring Margaret to see where she was born. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. She placed a hand on the main support beam, where David had carved their initials years before. A silent farewell to both the cabin and the man who had made it a home. Outside, the mountain had transformed overnight. The temperature had risen sharply, accelerating the melt. What had been knee-deep snow was now a patchwork of exposed ground and shallow drifts. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, the first tentative scent of renewal. Sarah secured Margaret against her chest, the baby contentedly sleeping after a morning feeding. Jacob shouldered their packs, distributing the weight to preserve Sarah's strength for walking. They stood at the cabin's threshold, a woman, a child, and a man united by circumstance and shared love for someone absent. "Ready?" Jacob asked. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling her body's lingering tenderness from birth, its newfound strength from motherhood. "Ready?" she affirmed. Their first steps away from the cabin felt momentous, the beginning of a journey back to civilization, to family, to the interconnected world they'd been separated from for months. The trail was muddy and treacherous in places where melt had destabilized the ground, but passable. As they reached the first ridge, Sarah paused, turning back for one final view of the cabin. From this distance it looked impossibly small against the vast mountain backdrop, a tiny outpost of humanity in wilderness that remained ultimately untamed. "We survived," she said, partly to Jacob, partly to herself. "No," Jacob corrected gently. "You did more than survive. You created life in the harshest conditions imaginable. That's beyond survival. That's triumph." Margaret stirred against Sarah's chest, making the small grunting sounds that preceded waking. Sarah adjusted the carrier to give her daughter a protected view of the world they were traveling toward. A world of other people, of roads and buildings, of complexity beyond the elemental simplicity of their mountain winter. "Onward then," Sarah said, turning away from the cabin toward the downward path. "We have quite a story to tell when we reach the bottom." Together they began the descent, following snowmelt down the mountain, their footprints marking the first human passage of a new season. Behind them stood the silent cabin, waiting, as it had for generations, for the next chapter of its story to unfold. Ahead lay the future, as unknown and full of possibility as the sleeping child held close against her mother's heart.